Okay, I'm starting today on page 3 of your green packet. So if you'll follow along, and you can pause this video as you need to fill in your notes. So first we're going to review what we did in the foldable last class. So if I have 3 sides marked congruent, I can prove the triangle is congruent by side, side, side. If I have side, angle, side, that is another of my options to prove it congruent. And it is very important that it is always in this order. It must be a side, angle in the middle, and another side, or we can't use this particular proof. Our next option is angle, side, angle. And again, the side is in the middle in between the 2 angles. And if our side is not in between the 2 angles, we just use a different proof where we can have angle, angle, and the side over here. And then our last option, if none of the others work and it is a right triangle, we check for hypotenuse leg. So hypotenuse is always the longest side directly across from the right angle. And so that would be our hypotenuse. A leg is either of the sides that touches the right angle. So now flip to your page 4 of your packet. And here we just start by labeling our parts that are the same. So for every A in this section, we're going to label AB is congruent to DE. We know that because of the 1 mark here. And we have the angle in the middle, so angle B is congruent to angle E. And again, it's marked for us. We're just following our markings. Our next one is BC is congruent to segment EF. And so that gave us a side, an angle, and a side. It is in the correct order, and so they are congruent by side, angle, side. Our congruent statement is when we just start with ABC and we match up the matching corners, so DEF will be our matching congruent statement. On our next example, we again just start by what they gave us. So our angle P is the same on both sides here. On this one, we can't just say angle P because I don't know which part of P that talks about. So I'm going to start by saying SPR. It is congruent with QPR. That gives me my angles that are congruent. Next, I have a side. If it's exactly the same line, it has to be the same length because it is the same line. So that's called PR is congruent to PR. We still have to list it twice because it's in both triangles. That is our reflexive property. And then my last one is I have another angle down here. It is a right angle. I still have to use 3 letters, so SRP is congruent to angle QRP. And so I have an angle, a side, and an angle that's in the correct order as my proof. And so it's angle, side, angle. My congruent statement is just SRP is congruent to triangle QRP. And our next one, we have side EH, or HE, is congruent to my FG. Then EF is congruent to GH. And I have this third side that is reflexive, so HF is congruent to HF, because it is reflexive. And so again, I have side, I have another side, I have another side. Therefore, they are congruent by side, side, side. And my congruent statement, here I'm going to start with E, with my outside angle, follow through to the 1 marked side first. So EHF is congruent. I start with my outside, go in the direction of the 1 first, and so that would be GFH. So go ahead next and flip over to page 5. So page 5, these weren't labeled for us, so our first step is we need to label them so we can write our congruent statement. And so I'm just labeling A, B, C, D. Make sure to label yours in the same order. And so angles A and D are congruent. Those are marked for us with 1 line. So that is my first statement. Angle A is congruent to angle D. My angle B and angle C are congruent, but I can't use just 1 letter here because they stretch out into more than 1 angle. So angle ABC is congruent to angle DCB. And so I just make sure I'm using the letters from the correct sides there. And then I have my reflexive side again. So BC is congruent to BC. That's my reflexive property. And so I have an angle, I have a side. That is one of my options for proofs. That is my answer, angle, angle, and side over here. My congruent statement is just going to be ABC is congruent to DCB. Alright, so number 5 has something else going on, is we have our arrows. Arrows mean that our lines are parallel. This does not mean the lines are the same length. It means they are parallel. When we have parallel lines, we know nothing about the length, but we do know that we can find some congruent angles from them. So our first step in this is going to look for our alternate interior angles, that if this is my transversal for my parallel lines, these angles have to be congruent. So that would be my angle MJL. I'm sorry, my angle MLJ, this angle down here, is congruent to angle KJL by alternate interior. So our alternate interior angles that we spent so much time with last unit. And then I can do it again on the other side, is having my angle KJ. On this side I have my other side of the angles are congruent, so now I have MJL is congruent to KLJ. And I mark them on here to help keep them straight. And again, I have my reflexive line in the middle. And so that is JL is congruent to JL, and that is reflexive. And so here I have an angle and a side, which isn't an option, but we can check in order. I have angle, side is actually in the middle, and I have another angle, and therefore they are congruent by angle, side, angle. And my congruent statement is just MLJ is congruent to triangle KJL, and I can go in the same order as those first angles I found. Okay, example 6. We are getting close to the end here. So here, I again this got printed without the letters, so this time I'm going to call this N, L, P, Q, and O. So you need to pause the video and label yours the same way. Next I'm going to go ahead and label my congruent sides that are marked for me. So OL is congruent to QL. That was marked for me. Then I have vertical angles. So anytime we have the crisscross lines here, I look for my vertical angles. And so again, I need the 3 letters so that I can see which part of L I'm talking about. So angle NLO is congruent to PLQ by vertical angles. And then I look. I'm not hypotenuse leg, so I need at least a 3rd part. Can I label any of these sides the same? Is there any information that lets me label those the same? Or is there any information that lets me mark an angle the same? And the answer is no. There's no other information there. Therefore, these are not congruent. So remember, not congruent is always an option. If there's not enough information there, we cannot prove that they are congruent. So last of all, go ahead and switch over to page 6. So on page 6, we again start by just seeing what is labeled the same. RS is the same as QP. So RS is congruent to QP. We have some angles they're saying. These are the simple angles, so we can just label them with 1 letter. Angle R is congruent to angle Q. And we have our reflexive line down the center. So PS is congruent to PS by reflexive. So now I check. I have an angle, I have a side, I have a side. That was not one of my options. I can only use 2 sides in an angle if the angle is in the middle. So then, since it's a right angle, I check, do I have a hypotenuse? My largest side straight across from the right angle. That would be my hypotenuse in the middle. And a leg. And yes, I do. And so these are congruent by hypotenuse leg. And my congruent statement is PRS is congruent to SQP. So then on our last 2 examples, it just asks us to mark the drawing with the information shown and then determine how they are congruent, or if they are congruent. So when we see the word midpoint of KW, first I find my KW line. E is in the middle. I know midpoint means equal halves, so I mark those 2 equal. Then KEG is congruent to WEH, so those are congruent, and angle K is congruent to angle W. That gives me my angle, my side, and my angle. So they are congruent by angle, side, angle. KEG would be congruent to WEH. And my example 9, I have a few things marked for me. So this whole line, FP, is congruent to PH. And then my angle F is congruent to angle H. Now on this one, it can be kind of hard to see exactly which triangles we're talking about. So this tells me I'm talking about PFS, which would be this triangle here. And it sometimes helps when you have overlapping figures, if it's hard to see, just to draw it to the side. If you can see it easily on there, you can leave it there. But since we have notes, I'm going to redraw these on the sides. So my 2 triangles, if they were not overlapping, would look something like this. And I already marked my PF is congruent to PH. My angle F is congruent to angle H. And because they overlap, P is the same angle. So P would be our reflexive angle. It is itself, so I can use it even though it's in both triangles. Therefore, they are congruent by my angle, side, angle. And it works on both sides. So angle, side, angle, my congruent statement, PFS is congruent to PHR.